Welcome back. In Part 1, we covered the years 1992 to 1995, including the first 4 claimed Eucharistic miracles of Buenos Aires, and the testing of those samples. So far, I have concluded that none of the tests were adequate to rule out natural explanations. But there were many more tests done in 1999, and we will look at those today. But first, there was another claimed miracle in 1996. Yes, we're finally getting to the famous one. The story is pretty similar to the 1992 incident. After communion, someone notified the priest that they had seen a communion wafer in a candlestick holder under a crucifix. As per protocol, the priest went to eat it, but found that it was too dusty, so it was put in water in the tabernacle just like the 1992 sample. Once again, it turned red. A photographer was called in. Here are his photographs. As the priest noted, it looks like something red that has fungus on it. Personally, I'd say it looks like something you'd find in your kid's lunchbox in September after forgetting to clean it out in June. Now, I know a lot of you are thinking, that's not the picture I've seen. And you would be right. Those are the pictures that the church shows, but the images shown by Castañón and Tesorero are slightly different. The blue color has strangely disappeared, making the mold less obvious. But a lot of you are probably thinking, that's still not the picture I've seen. You are thinking of this image, which is often associated with the Buenos Aires 1996 miracle. But it's actually an image from South Korean mystic Julia Kim. These wafers supposedly fell from the sky during Mass, and a few days later were found to have blood on them. Kim has been excommunicated by the Roman Catholic Church, which has made her miracle claims less popular, although she still has some followers. Her miracle claims are generally believed by Catholics to be either fraud or the work of demons. How this image came to be associated with the Buenos Aires case, I do not know. But it is not found in any of the sources closest to the event, and it has 2 wafers, while the Buenos Aires story only has 1. Instead of allowing the new Buenos Aires sample to dry out, the church stored it in a sealed tube of distilled water. It was left this way for 3 years. Next, Cardinal Jorge Bergoglio, who is now Pope Francis, asks for further investigation of these incidents. The team they give permission to investigate included Castañón, Tesorero, and Willesee, who we already know from Part 1 because they are the authors of the books that are our main sources. I've noticed some questions online about the authenticity of the Pope's involvement. I can confirm that these claims were published before Francis was elected Pope, when there would have been little reason to lie. He was the Archbishop of Buenos Aires at the time, and thus would have been the one responsible for improving investigations. And there is a picture of him with Castañón and Tesorero. Notably, there is also a letter from Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who later became Pope Benedict XVI, asking for information on the 1992 sample. So there was actually interest from 2 popes before either of them became pope. Castañón visited the church in the autumn of 1999 and was asked to begin an investigation. Castañón returned with Tesorero in October 1999 and interviewed everyone involved and took samples of both the 1992 and 1996 communion wafers. That's our samples A and E. Castañón and Tesorero then take the samples to Forensic Analytical in California. There is a lab report from Forensic Analytical dated May 1st, 2000. Here is the first page of the Forensic Analytical report from Castañón's book and from Tesorero's book. Notice that the top of both pages is identical, but then below this line, they're different. There is also a clear change in the font and resolution of Tesorero's document that makes it appear that Castañón's is the original. The second pages are also completely different, except for the signatures, which again seem to be taken from the same original. But the second page in Castañón's book is numbered 4 of 5, so 2 pages must have been skipped. And yet this text at the top seems like it would naturally follow the text on page 1. So it appears that both copies of the report have been altered, and we are missing most of the original 5 pages. Comparing the 2 documents, it looks like Tesorero's version has been edited to remove references to everything but sample 1-2, which is our incident E, the 1996 communion wafer. This makes some sense if the other samples were confidential, but then the transparent approach, and certainly the approach I would expect from a lawyer, would be to redact the information that couldn't be released. Instead, it appears as though the text of the document was retyped, with Dr. Keen's signature just pasted at the end. This raises ethical questions and makes it look like they might be hiding something. Castagnon's version lists all of the original samples, but only includes the screening of biological evidence section for samples 1-1, which is our sample A, the 1992 wafer, and 1-2, the 1996 wafer, omitting the other samples and the other sections. I don't have access to the original report, so I have to proceed with what we have here. First is a list of samples submitted. Tesorero's list contains only the 1996 specimen, described as a glass tube containing brownish material in clear liquid. Castagnon's copy contains 5 other samples. Sample 1-1 is the 1992 sample. It is described as a glass tube with brownish material. I have not found a single document where Tesorero mentions the existence of the 1992 miracle claim, even though he was present when the sample was taken, and according to this report, he personally dropped it off at the lab. Furthermore, we know that it was not confidential because Castagnon's book was published 5 years earlier and talks about it freely. As I mentioned in part 1, I consider the results for the 1992 sample to be relevant to the 1996 sample. If 1992 was found to be fraud or even a natural phenomenon, that is a good reason to be suspicious of a nearly identical miracle claim 4 years later at the same church. So I find it concerning that it appears as though Tesorero has put significant effort into concealing the existence of the 1992 sample. The identity of the remaining 4 samples is not explained by Castagnon, and of course not mentioned at all by Tesorero. Given the timing, I suspect that they submitted samples from a bleeding statue in Cochabamba around the same time, which were taken on cotton swabs. So it's likely that the remaining samples aren't related to the Buenos Aires case. Of course, an entire chapter of Tesorero's book is dedicated to this statue, so it is still a bit of a puzzle why he would omit those test results. The next section is titled Screening of Biological Evidence. The section on the 1992 sample is found only in Castagnon's copy. A Spanish translation is also found in Castagnon's other book. They first examine the specimen with a stereo microscope. I'll again use my digital microscope for comparison. Because the 1992 sample was dry, we'll be looking at my dry samples. We'll take a quick sidebar here because I've heard claims that if the red color had been produced by bacteria or fungi, it would crumble and fade as soon as it dried out. As you can see, all of my dried samples are still quite solid and quite red. The bacteria and fungi do either die or go into a spore form when dried out, but the pigment that they have already produced remains, as anyone who has had to clean red stains out of their bathroom sink would know. I've made no special attempts to preserve any of these samples, and the oldest ones are almost 4 years old. Getting back to the lab report, their main observation is a hair or possible hair fragment attached to the sample. I don't see any hairs in my samples, but it would certainly be possible for that kind of a contamination to occur on a wafer sitting exposed in an open container. Interestingly, I've never heard anyone claim that this is the hair of Jesus, so obviously most people seem to recognize this as contamination. For the still wet 1996 sample, they noted, while wet, the reddish-brown material was observed to be attached to a white fibrous material, but no identifiable characteristics were noted. Tesorero seems to interpret this to mean that the red material was attached to the wafer. But wet wafers do not appear fibrous. The white fibers on my wet sample are fungi. It next says that on drying, a dark brown particulate matter was noted. This does seem to be different. All of my samples have dried into solid pieces, although they will crumble to particulate matter if you rub them. This is notably not a feature of heart tissue, which dries into jerky. And blood clots dry into a hard solid. Next, they do an orthotolidine test for blood. Both samples are negative. This chemical was used on the Cumber test strips before 1992 when it was found to be carcinogenic. It was replaced with 3,3'5'5' tetramethylbenzidine. Some forensics labs and even field researchers still use orthotolidine, but most now use the newer chemical, as do my tests. Either way, the chemical reaction is very similar. It's very sensitive, so it can detect trace amounts of blood, but it's not very specific. This means there are many other substances that can give a false positive. But that doesn't matter here because both tests were negative, indicating that there was no hemoglobin. the protein that makes blood red, in the sample. So it definitely was not a blood clot. However, one of the other chemicals which will test positive if trace amounts are present is myoglobin, the protein that makes muscle red, which would mean it also was not heart tissue. Could this be a false negative because the samples are so old? In fact, it must be a false negative for the 1992 sample, right? Because 7 years earlier, they got a positive result with essentially the same test. How well does this test work with aged samples? I don't have any bits of muscle that have been sitting at room temperature for 7 years to test it on. The best I can do is this bit of chicken heart that I let dry about 7 months ago. I put it in a bit of distilled water on the right and a bit of the wafer that gave the strongest positive result a few months ago on the left. 5 minutes later, there is a clear positive for the heart, but the wafer is negative. So clearly, a moldy wafer that tested positive can become negative after it dries, and a heart tissue can stay positive for at least 7 months. For longer time frames, we'll have to turn to scientific studies, which unfortunately aren't usually testing for our exact scenario. But after a thorough literature search, I didn't see any examples of false negative results for blood or muscle that were less than 10 years old. Even for archaeological samples, the main concern is usually false positives due to contamination. As one test manufacturer notes, for the test not to detect blood, it has to have decayed to such an extent that it no longer contains the heme molecule, and at that point, by definition, it's no longer blood. The heme molecule is what gives hemoglobin and myoglobin their red color. If the sample was so thoroughly decayed that a test this sensitive couldn't detect heme molecules, it is unlikely that the sample would still appear red. The microbial peroxidases that gave me the false positive on my wafers, on the other hand, break down more easily. And the color on my wafers doesn't come from heme. It presumably comes from either prodigiosin, the pigment produced by Serratia bacteria, or the carotenoid compounds produced by Epicoccum fungi. So the sample doesn't contain hemoglobin or myoglobin. Could it still be miraculous Jesus heart tissue? If it doesn't produce myoglobin, it's fundamentally not heart tissue. You can't have a functioning heart without myoglobin. Furthermore, if you for some reason had heart cells without myoglobin, they would be transparent, not red. And the only reason that this wafer was taken for testing in the first place was that it turned red. If there's no hemoglobin and no myoglobin in the sample, what is producing the red color? This is a very simple and objective test, and it indicated that neither sample contained heart tissue or blood. Next, they do a quantiblot test. This test measures how much primate DNA is in a sample. They do this by finding a specific sequence of DNA, which is repeated over and over again in the centromeres of humans and other primates. Centromeres are these bits in the middle of every chromosome, so every human cell has 46 of them, and the sequence is repeated many times in each of them. This makes the test very good with small amounts of DNA or degraded DNA because it doesn't need to find a sequence that only exists once per cell. The point of the quantiblot is right in the name. It gives a quantity in nanograms of primate DNA. The test is usually done to determine if there is enough human DNA to bother with more expensive tests. It is designed to be run with controls of known concentrations of human DNA, typically ranging from 0.15 nanograms, which is approximately the amount of DNA in 25 cells, to 5 nanograms, which is over 800 cells. The test results are then compared with each of the bands so you can tell what range they fall into. However, this report doesn't give any numbers and says only that a very low concentration was obtained. Similarly, a message from the lab on December 9, 1999, indicated that minimal amounts of human DNA were recovered from samples A1 to A2. Why are they using terms like very low and minimal instead of giving a specific number? Presumably because the line was fainter than the faintest control band, which is typically 0.15 nanograms. This is further supported by the fact that 0.1 to 0.2 nanograms is about the limit where PCR-STR analysis becomes unreliable, and the report states that the quantity detected was insufficient for that test. Quantiblot results for a single plucked human hair range from 0.28 nanograms to 1.64 nanograms. So they are talking about a very small quantity of DNA, even less than would be found in the root of a single human hair. A hair was mentioned in the lab report for the 1992 sample, and another one is visible in the pictures of the 1996 sample. So obviously contamination with a small amount of human DNA shouldn't be a surprise. I would expect any of my samples to have that much human DNA simply from being around me. We are constantly shedding hair and skin cells that become dust and settle on objects around us. If the red material, or anything we can see with the naked eye, was human, this test would give a much larger result. The result they got is almost certainly the result of contamination. There are a variety of possible sources of contamination in the story of this sample. These include skin cells from a priest or altar server handling the wafer before it was blessed, or from the person distributing communion. Cells from the individual who received the wafer on their hand or on their tongue. Human skin cells in the dust of the candlestick. Cells from any of the various people staring into the bowl, photographing the sample, transferring the contents into the test tube, or taking the sample unmasked. So no one should have expected the QuantaBlot test to come back completely negative. These are the results that would be expected for an ordinary wafer that had been handled by humans, and not what would be expected for human tissue. Even though the lab had advised them that there was insufficient DNA for PCR genetic marker typing, they paid for the test anyway. This is the test that was intended to identify which individual the DNA came from. For example, if that human DNA came from a hair falling out of Castagnon's unmasked mustache as he leaned over the sample, you could use this test to determine that the DNA matched Castagnon's and discard the results. Based on the set of loci listed here, I'm assuming they used Thermo Fisher's AMP-Pfister Profiler Plus PCR amplification kit, although the report does not specify. The kit recommends a DNA sample of 1 to 2.5 nanograms, although they say smaller samples have been successfully profiled. Anything below 0.1 to 0.2 nanograms is considered low template DNA and starts to give unreliable results. So this kit would not be expected to get a result with less than 0.15 nanograms of human DNA. And it didn't. The report states that insufficient DNA for successful PCR analysis was obtained from item 1-2. As requested, PCR-STR analysis was attempted on the sample, but no reportable genetic profile was obtained. These results are repeatedly presented as surprising by Tesoriero and Castagnon, but they shouldn't be. The quantity of DNA found by the QuantaBlot was low enough that the experts weren't expecting a result from the PCR-STR, and they didn't get one. The point of the QuantaBlot was to determine if there was enough human DNA for the PCR-STR to work. It found that there probably wasn't, they tried anyway, and it failed. That's the predicted result. I see no indication that any expert was at all surprised by this. I assume that this is the test that Castagnon and Tesoriero are referring to when they say things like, the double helix could not be obtained, and the DNA would not reveal its sequence. However, this test would not reveal the structure or sequence of the DNA even if it had been successful. To see the double helix structure of the DNA, they would have to use X-ray crystallography. And sequencing, to actually reveal the sequence of amino acids in the DNA, would have been prohibitively expensive for even small sections in 1999. The draft sequence of the full human genome wasn't even published until 2003. The negative results of this test do not indicate that there was something unusual about the DNA, only that it was not human. The last DNA test performed is quite similar to the serum protein electrophoresis we discussed in part 1, except that instead of sorting proteins by size, it sorts DNA molecules by size. This allows you to determine the quality and quantity of the DNA present. Good quality DNA that is intact has large molecules and thus will form a nice tight band at the top of the gel. DNA that is breaking down becomes a lot of shorter strands, so you'll get a smear of DNA of all different sizes. The good quality mentioned in the report means that they got that nice tight band. If the sample was primarily made of human tissue that was so degraded after 3 years stored in distilled water that the QuantaBlot was only able to recognize small amounts as human, that degraded DNA would have shown up as a smear on this test. It didn't, which indicates that there was no significant amount of degraded DNA. They compared the amount of DNA in that band to the result they got from the QuantaBlot and found that there was much more of it. That means that the primate DNA they found was a tiny proportion of the overall DNA in the sample. The tissue contained a minuscule amount of human DNA and a bunch of DNA from other organisms. So what is all of this DNA from? Unfortunately, this test doesn't provide much information on that. All we know is that the DNA is over 20 to 25 kilobases. But the genome of every organism is bigger than that. All animals, plants, fungi, and bacteria would be in this band if their DNA was intact. Only some viruses are smaller. So the DNA could be from the wheat in the wafer, or from the bacteria and fungi growing on it. Or it could be a chunk of chicken heart added by a prankster. All we can conclude from this testing is that it is not human and it is not degraded. Looking at the results of these lab tests, there is absolutely nothing that would be unexpected for a dirty communion wafer left soaking in water until it molded. There are several findings that would be unexpected if it was human heart tissue, including the negative orthotolidine test and the low amount of human DNA found. Why didn't the experts at the forensics lab tell them that? Of course, they didn't know anyone was going to claim it was heart tissue. That declaration is still years in the future. So they had no reason to be surprised by the negative orthotolidine test. But what about the DNA test? Tesoriero says that the forensics laboratory was baffled as to why they couldn't get the victim's DNA profile. But that's not present in the portion of the lab report that is available to us. The report seems to explain quite clearly why there wasn't any result. Of course, we don't know what was said in the missing portions or in other correspondence. But Tesoriero seems to delight in saying that scientists are baffled, so I have trouble imagining that something like that would have been omitted. And Castagnon says that most of the experts they consulted conclude that the lack of human DNA is either due to deterioration of the sample or an insufficient quantity of it. So it appears they were told that the sample didn't contain significant human DNA. The real question is, why didn't they listen? Tesoriero and Castagnon had investigated previous miracle claims together, most of which they had deemed authentic. That in itself seems miraculous. I think most people realize that most claimed miracles are either fraud or misinterpretations of natural events. And even the Catholic Church itself doesn't claim success rates as high as Castagnon does. So it would seem that either this team was extremely lucky, or they were authenticating miracles that weren't authentic. I haven't looked at their previous work very closely, but I get the impression that if you tried to recalculate their success rate in 2025 based on all of the ones that have since been proven inauthentic, you would get a much lower number. One of the things they concluded from their previous work was that in the cases they consider authentic, a DNA profile could not be obtained. They therefore consider the lack of a DNA profile to be a control variable for miraculous specimens. I don't know if there was actually something unusual in these previous cases. I don't have the lab reports for them, but I see no evidence of anything unusual in this case. And it seems like the idea that there is something surprising about these results came from Castagnon and Tesoriero, not from the forensics lab. There is absolutely no sign of a miracle or even fraud having occurred prior to these tests. As of May 1st, 2000, the only tests that should have been able to distinguish a regular moldy wafer like mine from human heart tissue were consistent with it being a moldy wafer and inconsistent with heart tissue. Yet you've all seen the videos of experts looking at the tissue under the microscope and claiming to see human heart. We'll look at those observations in part 3. Bye for now.